Hey, friends, welcome back. This is Peace and Power, the peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are wrapping up our study on the Book of Ruth. We're actually coming to a conclusion, and this is the study of the Book of Ruth where we're learning not just how to study Ruth, but also how to study the entire Bible, kind of putting it together. And we have seen in Ruth that since it is a narrative, it's been important to look at the overarching plot, to figure out the characters, to look at the tension and the conflict and the drama that's happening in the story. And then we've also dug into some very specific words and some contexts that needed to be defined so that we understand what is going on. And it's probably good to say that if we've been following along carefully and we've been paying attention, we have a good grasp on what the Book of Ruth says, and we're working to a pretty decent understanding of what the Book of Ruth means. And now that we've figured out those two things, we can go on to thinking through some of the ways to apply the Book of Ruth to our lives today. That is the order. What it says, what it means, how to apply. We need to work through those things in order. And interestingly enough, as we look at the applications, I'm going to use some history about the Book of Ruth to show that a book basically only says one thing, and it only means one thing. But especially with a narrative story like Ruth, you can apply it in several different ways. And we'll look at this with something that's actually unique with the Book of Ruth. In ancient history, the Book of Ruth was written on a scroll. And these scrolls were kept in libraries and shelves together, but they were individual entities. So when they were trying to take these scrolls and put them into either lists like tables of contents or put them into codexes or the first books, they had to choose where to put the books of the Bible and what order to put the books of the Bible in, because they weren't really in an order before, they were individual scrolls. And with the Book of Ruth, we see that they've chose three different places to put the Book of Ruth, and each one of that opens up a different application of the Book of Ruth. So the first one is where we see it today in most of our Bibles. It's where it's found in the Septuagint. It comes immediately after Judges. And Josephus, in his list and his numbering of the books of the Old Testament, actually counted Judges and Ruth as one book. So it was closely associated with the book of Judges, either immediately following it or so closely associated with the book of Judges that it was counted as one book. So, and we see this in Ruth 1, it starts off as during the time of the judges. So, this is a very easy placement of that book, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And what we see here is this idea that Boaz and Ruth, and actually the entire town of Bethlehem, create this idyllic following of the Old Testament law of the Pentateuch in a way that creates a sharp contrast with what we know about the book of Judges. Book of Judges is kind of chaotic. Bethlehem in the book of Ruth is idyllic. The heroes in the book of Judges are all fallen and flawed greatly. Boaz is amazing, is the epitome of the kinsman redeemer. So when you associate Ruth with the book of Judges, you get this idea that it's about faithfulness in a very unfaithful time. That could be one of the main themes about the book of Ruth. You see God being faithful to Naomi. You see Ruth being faithful to Naomi. You see Boaz being faithful to God, and Boaz being faithful as a kinsman redeemer both to Ruth and Naomi. This idea of faithfulness in unfaithful times comes out. And we can apply that to our lives by saying that no matter what times we find ourselves, even if we find ourselves in something like the book of Judges, in the times of Judges, when every man did what he thought was right in his own eyes. If that is true of our own times, we can still be faithful. We can still be faithful to God. We can still be faithful to one another. We can still be faithful. And God will still be faithful to us. Faithfulness in an unfaithful time is one of the three possible applications for the book of Ruth. But that's not the only place the book of Ruth shows up in these Old Testament orderings. Another place where it is, it's called a part of the megalith. And these are 5 scrolls read during specific Jewish festivals. The book of Ruth would be read at Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, which is very fitting for the book of Ruth because Pentecost is a harvest festival. It is, and the book of Ruth revolves around the harvest. These 5 scrolls, Song of Solomon was read at Passover, Lamentations was read at the anniversary of the destruction of Jerusalem, Ecclesiastes was read at the Feast of the Tabernacles, and Esther was read at Purim. These 5 scrolls were kind of included together, and they came immediately following Proverbs and immediately following Proverbs 31. If you know anything about Proverbs 31 ends with Proverbs 31:10 starts off with this phrase, "Who can find a woman of noble character?" That's verse 10, and then the following verses in Proverbs 31 go along to describe what this woman of noble character is like. And when we read Proverbs 31 by itself, we think that's a rhetorical question. Who can find a woman of noble character? But if Ruth comes immediately following, and you see in Ruth that Boaz is called a man of noble character, same exact word, just the masculine form of it, and Ruth is called a woman of noble character, same exact word, we start to think, oh, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't a rhetorical question. Maybe the answer to that question, who can find a woman of noble character, is Boaz. Boaz found a woman of noble character. And how did Boaz find a woman of noble character? He found her by being a man of noble character. So that changes the end of Proverbs 31, the end of Proverbs, as instead of how do I find a good woman, it's how do I be a man who can find a good woman. Or it changes the how do I become a good woman, a woman of noble character, and it's this idea, well, I emulate Ruth. So in this passage, if we want to be men and women of noble characters, today we emulate the actions of Ruth and Boaz. We are faithful, we are noble, we show hesed to one another, we become like Boaz and Ruth. And this is how it could apply to us today. Instead of looking for the right Mr. or Mrs. Right, it's about becoming Mr. and Mrs. Right. Now, the last placement is in some Talmudic lists. Ruth immediately precedes the Psalms. And it can be seen as an introduction to King David, the major author of the Psalms. And the very last word in the book of Ruth, as kind of like a climax, is the word David. It ends on David. And immediately preceding the Psalms, this idea of David, it could be seen as an apology, a defense of the Davidic monarchy. David had noble characters in his bloodline. Even if they were ordinary Israelites, even if they were foreigners, David had nobility in his bloodline. And we see this, that that this is an apology for David, that even in the time of the judges, there were these noble characters who are David's ancestors. Even this Moabite was noble. Even this ordinary citizen of Israel was a noble character, and they are providing this foundation for David. And it's this idea that even in the time of the judges, God is working his plans. Even from two widows, God is working his plan. Even throughout this little rinky-dink town of Bethlehem, God is working his plan to this, bring about David and this Davidic monarchy. God will accomplish his plans even in dark times like the book of Judges. We can apply this to our lives knowing that, we're in COVID. God is still accomplishing his plans even during COVID. And we see a lot of racial tension and racial upheaval in our country. God is still God is still able to establish his plans even in the midst of this. And not only that, but we could say at times because of COVID or because of this racial tension, God is producing the people of such noble character that they will be used by him for furthering his kingdom. The times of the judges produced these noble predecessors to King David. What kind of people are these times producing? So those are three possible applications of this wonderful story of Ruth. There are probably many others, but those are just looking at some of the historical placements of the Book of Ruth and how they can be possible interpretations of this wonderful, wonderful story. So now, looking again, where there are two ways to always join us. Peace and Power is live on Monday nights at 7 p.m. and we will continue to do these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress, and I'm all over social media. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Find the links in the description below. As always, it was a pleasure being with you. Hope to see you again.